Good afternoon. My name is Deborah Miller. I'm coming to you from the Council of State Governments National Headquarters. We apologize for the little late start, but I think we're only a couple of minutes behind. We're doing today a webinar on entrepreneurship, tax incentives, and procurement. I want to go over a couple of the housekeeping details before we get started with our participants. All of you who have called in will be in listen-only mode, but you can use the GoToMeeting box up in the right-hand corner of your screen at any time and type in any questions you have for all presenters or a particular presenter. And as we get time to ask those questions, we'll do that from here in Lexington. The audio and the slides will be posted following this webinar on the CSG Knowledge Center. And as an attendee or anyone who signed up for the webinar, you'll receive a link to that audio and slides. So that's the housekeeping piece. It's my pleasure now to introduce to you Ted Townsend. He currently is the COO of the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development, and appropriately so, since this is also a webcast on entrepreneurship, also began and was CEO of his own company in Tennessee before he turned his talents to working for state government in Tennessee. He also has served as the co-chair of one of the subcommittees of the National Task Force on Workforce Development for People with Disabilities. So he's going to tell you a little about this task force that CSG and NCSL jointly staffed, and then we'll introduce our first speaker. Ted, I'm turning it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Deb. I appreciate it, and welcome everyone to the webinar today. Thanks for your time and attention on such a very important issue to all of us who have been honored with the opportunity to be a part of the National Task Force. So the Council of State Governments, in partnership with the National Conference of State Legislatures, convened the National Task Force on Workforce Development for People with Disabilities. As leading associations representing state policymakers, CSG and NCSL are uniquely poised to highlight the issue of disability employment at the state level. The National Task Force oversaw the work of 4 subcommittees that Deb mentioned, and each of those focusing on a unique policy area that would impact the employment of people with disabilities. Those include career readiness and employability, hiring, retention, and reentry, entrepreneurship, tax and procurement incentives, and technology, transportation, and other employment supports. Each subcommittee was composed of 10 to 12 state leaders and 4 to 6 non-voting external advisors representing the private sector, key stakeholders, and/or academia. The members and leadership of the National Task Force have accomplished much in a short amount of time, and I want to thank them for their service and commend them for the work that went into the recommendations in the report. In addition to the success of the task force identifying policy options to help state leaders move the needle on disability employment policy, members of the task force and subcommittees already have signaled policy movement in their states, which we will cover some of those today. We explore in this work a diverse range of components that can influence the development of the workforce of people with disabilities. The report serves as a guide on each of the policy areas the task force explored and is designed to assist states in improving the ways the public sector serves people with disabilities and provide state examples of innovative programs and policies and best practices that have been observed nationally. A key tenet of the framework is having people with disabilities at the table, certainly when policy decisions are made, but certainly how those policies are crafted from the very beginning. So we encourage everyone on the call today to read the full report for more explanations on the recommendations. Deb?
Okay, so our first speaker today is Michael Morris. Michael serves as the director of the National Disability Institute, and he was an advisor to the National Task Force. Mr. Morris, thank you so much for being with us, and we'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Deb, and thank you, Ted. I think this project is very important to help really put a spotlight on opportunities for policy change at a state level that can complement individual and systems change level policy change at a federal level. So let's go to my first slide on tax policy. All of us spend a lot of time thinking about authorizing legislation, funding streams, really trying to put forward incentives to improve employment and entrepreneurship for people with disabilities. But all too often we ignore tax policy, which can be a very critical driver for social change. Tax policy offers opportunities to create incentives to change individual or systems behavior, both in the public and private sector. Tax policy also can support employment outcomes and economic mobility for people with as well as without disabilities. As we will share with you, tax policy can also support employer incentives in hiring and also help remove barriers to an inclusive workforce. And then finally, tax policy can also support entrepreneurship and business startup and growth. Next slide. At a federal level, we've had for a number of years a variety of incentives that have been enacted to really change behavior and influence what people do and what corporations and employers do. We've had the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, which reimburses employers for a percentage of workers' wages, including workers with disabilities who are on Social Security benefits. We have things like the Disabled Access Credit for small businesses, which is to help cut the cost through a tax credit, pay for costs that help purchase or modify equipment, help improve communication access for employees with disabilities, as well as for interacting with customers with disabilities. And even more long-standing is architectural and transportation barrier removal deductions, again, for purchase of equipment or modification of facilities. Next slide. So what are some of the things we can do looking ahead? And there are two other federal level policies that really can be leveraged and complemented and have been for some time at a state level. The first is the Earned Income Tax Credit, signed into law back in the day of President Nixon, bipartisan approach to actually improve the level of wages, help reduce poverty for working age adults with and without disabilities. And over 25 states have created Earned Income Tax Credit programs for low-income workers in terms of their own state tax code. And there is more recently the Achieving a Better Life Experience Act, or ABLE. In the last 2 years, over 30 states have passed laws to authorize the creation of ABLE accounts. Next slide. So where can we focus and hope that in your listening today you get new ideas from both me and Jill and the others on this webinar. So for employers, we can look at tax policy to create incentives for procurement of products and or services for small businesses owned by persons with disabilities. We can also create tax incentives for hiring and retaining workers with disabilities. And we can, again, for states with an income tax, create state tax credits and deductions to remove physical and or communication barriers and even promote customized employment, which makes for a more inclusive workforce, but may also increase opportunity for interaction with customers with disabilities. Next slide, please. If we take a look at the Earned Income Tax Credit, it's a refundable tax credit to benefit working people with low to moderate income. The opportunities, which has gotten bipartisan support and is beginning to gain some leverage and interest, is moving from the federal tax credit rules to changing it at a state level, where you could lower the age from 25 down to 21 or 18, and you could increase what the benefit is of this Earned Income Tax Credit for individuals with disabilities who are on SSI without family members to earn and receive an enhanced benefit. The benefit works now where if you are a family, so there are two people who are wage earners or one who's a wage earner and another lead person in that family, and you have children, you get more at the federal level, and that's the way many states have modeled their earned income tax credit. But there's opportunities here to create incentives to help people with disabilities get out of poverty. It's only for earned income, and so it's an opportunity to provide an incentive to get people back to work or for work for the first time. Next slide, please. Let me turn to ABLE. Many of you may be familiar with ABLE, Achieving a Better Life Experience Act, signed into law at a federal level in 2014. In the last 2 years, excuse me, some 30 states have passed their own model ABLE program, modeled after the state requirement, the federal requirements. What ABLE does is create a tax advantage savings account for qualified disability expenses. It offers a tax deduction for contributions to an ABLE account in a number of states. It offers incentives, potentially. It could be for employer match to an ABLE account contribution, similar to IRAs, similar to college savings plans. So there's an opportunity to use the tax code in unique ways to help people with disabilities build the size of contributions and ultimately the growth on investment of their ABLE account. What an ABLE account is for is many, many qualified disability expenses. For our purposes, it could help someone go to work. It could cover transportation costs that no one else is covering, either publicly or privately covered. It could pay for additional personal assistance services. It could purchase technology. It could help someone even start their own business. And none of this will count against their other public benefits at a federal level. And in some states, it can't count against public benefits at a state level. So there's an opportunity here to rethink. It's not just pouring more money in at a federal level or a state level, but it's using the tax code to incentivize savings and encourage people with disabilities who want to work and save and have financial goals, but better economic future. The ABLE account is a way states could look at really helping that individual with a disability grow that account and even encourage others, family, friends, employers to contribute to the account. Next slide, please. To learn more about ABLE, some of you may not be as familiar with it. You can go to the ABLE National Resource Center, www.ablenrc.org. There's an interactive map. You can touch your state and look at the current status of where you are in moving forward with ABLE implementation. Have you passed state legislation? Has the program actually been created yet? Right now, there are only 5 states in the country who have opened their ABLE programs, but I would really predict by the spring of next year, we're going to see closer to 20 states that have open ABLE programs. And what I've offered you here is some additional ways to use the focus on ABLE, but using the tax code to incentivize savings, to encourage work, to encourage entrepreneurship, which is really was the work of our task force. So let me just give you 3 quick examples of how some of these kinds of ideas work. Next slide. A hiring tax deduction. We have the Work Opportunities Tax Credit at a federal level, but more than a dozen states have passed laws at a state level that encourage employers to hire individuals with disabilities by providing a tax deduction for a percentage of wages. In Iowa, it's 65% of wages for 12 months and a maximum deduction of $20,000 per employee with disability over a period of years. So that's an example how this can work. Another example, next slide, is this ABLE contribution tax deduction. One of the most liberal was done by the state of South Carolina. And the state of South Carolina has a deduction from state income tax liability for contributions made to an ABLE account. And they made that contribution that's tax deductible all the way up to the maximum federal limit of $14,000 annually. So that's quite a incentive or a motivator to get people thinking about whether it's someone's son or daughter, it could be a nephew, it could be a grandson, a granddaughter, is to think about opening an ABLE account. And I really describe ABLE as a kind of down payment on freedom. Freedom in terms of pursuing employment, pursuing entrepreneurship, pursuing independent living, and greater community participation. But it's another way to use the tax code so that it's not just public dollars, but it's using the tax code to motivate and incentivize specific behaviors. Another example, next slide, is procurement preference. And there are more than a few states. I share with you an example from Alaska, where business owners with disabilities get a preference in a procurement bid applied to their price in a bid. 10% preference in the highly competitive nature of procurement could be all the difference in the world and could move an entrepreneur, a business owner with a disability, from coming in second or third to actually winning a bid. Many states have gone beyond this procurement preference to also look at opportunities for really supporting the startup of businesses to be owned by people with disabilities with low-cost loans. And Jill, I'm sure, will share with you a number of states have begun and really gotten very involved with U.S. Business Leadership Network in terms of the certification and the qualifications of a business owner with disabilities. So I'll stop there. I hopefully have given you an array of ideas that tax policy is a great catalyst for change. It's an incentive driver. It's a behavior changer. And I hope some of these ideas will give you things to think about. My last slide is contact. If you'd love to talk with me more, I unfortunately can't stay for this entire webinar, but there's my email address, mmorris@ndi-inc.org. You can also look at the work of National Disability Institute at www.realeconomicimpact.org. Thank you so much, and I'll turn it back to, I believe, Deb.
That's right. Thanks, Michael, so much. And the state examples that you provided, there will be many more of those in the written report of the National Task Force. And that report will be out in very early December. It's literally at the printers as we speak now. So we will have that, and we'll unveil it at our national meeting in Williamsburg. So those of you who are on the webinar obviously know how to find CSG, so you'll know how to find the report when it's available as well. Our next speaker, thank you, Michael, very much for participating. And we'll let you go on to whatever your next meeting is that you have, but we appreciate the time you spent with us today.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jill Houghton. Jill is the President and CEO of the U.S. Business Leaders Network. She also served as an advisor to the National Task Force on Workforce Development for People with Disabilities. And as Michael suggested, she's actually in touch with and has the pulse of the U.S. business community. And she's going to give us some insights on what she's learned through talking with those folks and how we could work with private businesses.
Well, thank you, Deb. This is Jill Houghton, and for those of you not familiar with the U.S. Business Leadership Network, as Deb said, we represent business. We're a nonprofit, and we really bring business together around leveraging disability inclusion really across their business. Next slide. When it comes to self-employment, I think it's really interesting to notate that people with disabilities are actually twice as likely to be self-employed as people without disabilities. And that statistic is taken from the Census Bureau. If you want to go to the next slide. For those of you that are not familiar with supplier diversity, I think it's a real important concept to be aware of because it's an effort that really grew out of government in the 60s, in the late 60s, in an effort to encourage the private sector to begin to help really minority-owned businesses that were disenfranchised. And it was government's way of encouraging the private sector to try to address their social responsibility. If we fast forward to today and we look at supplier diversity, it's really an initiative that, in addition to being championed by government, it's also led by business, because business sees it as a way to integrate their whole approach to economic development and really enhancing their brand across their business, so that by including businesses who are owned by minorities or owned by women or owned by people with disabilities or LGBT, that they are then also working it into their strategies to reach this market. Next slide. So in terms of what we call at the USBLN the Disability Supplier Diversity Program, just to give you some background, really business came to us and said, we want to include disability-owned businesses in our supplier diversity program, just like we include minorities and women and in some cases LGBT. But we need a third party that can help to help us demonstrate that these companies are really 51% owned, operated, controlled, and managed by a person or persons with disabilities. And so they looked to us to create a certification, and in so doing, we didn't recreate the wheel. We went to other third parties that currently operate in this space that your states and corporations that reside in your states do business with. So specifically, we began to work with the Women's Business Enterprise National Council, or what we refer to as WBENC, WBENC. And probably most of your states recognize the WBENC certification, for example, of women-owned business enterprises. And so WBENC and actually as well the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce took us under their wing and said, you don't have to recreate the wheel. We'll teach you about certification. And so our program was launched in January of 2010. Next slide. And at this point, we certify businesses as being disability-owned or service-disabled veteran disability-owned. Next slide. So in terms of understanding what certification is and what it isn't, you know, I think that it's really important that you understand that certification, whether it's through a state or through a for-profit business, that certification is viewed as a tool that exists to help diverse businesses grow their business. It helps to give that assurance to your state or assurance to a corporation that the business that you're getting ready to do business with really meets the conditions of being 51% owned, operated, controlled, and managed by. But, you know, one thing that we know is that certification isn't and should never be expected to take the place of normal business planning. So, you know, we make it a point to tell businesses that certification does not guarantee that you're going to get business. You've got to, you know, business owners have to have everything in place. This is just an extra tool that exists to help differentiate their business. I think it's important to notate that there are a growing number of corporations that are really looking to identify and certify and include doing business with disability-owned businesses as well as service-disabled veteran disability-owned businesses. Next slide. So right now we do certification for three for three types of businesses. One is what we call Adobe, a disability-owned business enterprise. So again, it's for-profit owned business that's 51% owned, controlled, operated, and managed by a person or persons with disabilities. We also certify for a veteran disability-owned business, which is essentially a business that is owned by a veteran but whose disability was not incurred during their time of service. And then we certify for what we call an SDV-DOBE, which is a service disability veteran disability-owned business enterprise, which is for a veteran who did sustain their disability during their time of service. Next slide. I would just call out on this slide that I think it's important to notate that there are over 100 corporations at this time who recognize these certifications. Next slide. So in terms of what are the criteria, so I've talked a lot about the first bullet around the ownership, operation, management, and control. The other areas that a business has to demonstrate that they can meet is that they must exercise independence from any other business enterprise. They must have their principal place of business, their headquarters must reside in the U.S. They must be formed as a legal entity in the United States. They must be a for-profit enterprise. The process takes around 90 days from the date of the receipt of when we get the certification or the application. And the certification is valid for 1 year, and you have to annually renew in order to maintain your status. Next slide. In terms of the definition that we use for disability, we actually worked with the city of Chicago, who was the first city in the nation to include disability-owned businesses in their Supplier Diversity program, as well as we worked with a lot of different national disability organizations and business partners, and we did focus groups for the period of a year. And where we fell is that the way we define disability is based on the first two prongs, actually, of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the disability is a physical, a mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities and includes individuals who have a learning disability. And then we went along with the federal definition of a service-disabled veteran. Next slide. Just showing you the 15 companies that helped us to stand up this certification program, 2 of which are quasi-government entities because there is a federal kind of crack in the ceiling, if you will, in this space that happened with the Economic Recovery Act in 2008, where the Federal Housing Finance Agency that oversees the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the Federal Home Loan Banks began to include disability-owned businesses in their supplier diversity requirements for these quasi-government agencies. Next slide. So why disability supplier inclusion is that, you know, it really helps to improve the corporate image in the marketplace. It helps to support growing a culture of diversity and inclusion. We know that whether it's state government trying to be more inclusive of people with disabilities, or it's a business trying to be more inclusive of people with disabilities, that culture oftentimes trumps strategy, and that state government and that for-profit entities really need to work on increasing being more inclusive in terms of your culture. And one of the ways that you can do that is also by including not just people with disabilities in your workplace, but businesses owned by people with disabilities in your procurement. And so as state government, you have the power to do that. Next slide. So in terms of state government, there are three pictures on here. On the left is a picture of Governor Baker when he issued an executive order last November to include disability-owned businesses in their state procurement, along with LGBT-owned businesses in their state procurement, and then signed an agreement with the USBLN, and we actually are now doing certification for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for the next 20 years. And then to the far right, there's the seal for the state of Pennsylvania, and a year ago, September, Governor Wolf signed an executive order to include disability-owned businesses in their state procurement, and now the state of Pennsylvania is the second state to recognize the USBLN certification for disability-owned businesses. And then in the middle, you see a picture of us with Senator Brad Hoylman in New York, along with our local affiliate in New York, and our friends at the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce. Senator Hoylman introduced a bill in the last session to include disability-owned businesses and LGBT-owned businesses. It was at the end of the session, and so we expect this bill to be reintroduced, and we're working hard in New York and would love to be working with all states across this nation to begin to include disability-owned businesses. Next slide. This is contact information. You see a link to our website, usbln.org, and you can click under what we do and Supplier Diversity to learn more about the certification, which is all done online via an online portal, and as well as my name and my email. So back to you, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Jill. And now Ted will talk a little about the recommendations that have been made around entrepreneurship, tax incentives, and procurement strategies of the National Task Force. He's kind of given you a sneak preview before the report comes out next month.
Great. Thanks so much, Deb. So the first slide you see here is the Entrepreneurship, Tax Incentives, and Procurement Subcommittee. I had the honor of serving with Senator Heath Mello. It actually says health, and we all wish him great health, but it's Senator Heath Mello with Nebraska. He served as chair. I served as co-chair of the committee. Next slide, please. So the National Task Force, I mentioned in my opening remarks the 4 subcommittees that came out of the entire effort. The task force membership, the national co-chairs, I didn't mention those. Delaware Governor Jack Markell, who's CSG president, and Nebraska State Senator Bo McCoy, who's CSG chair. And each of the subcommittees that you see there listed had 2 co-chairs, and I certainly served with Senator Mello on the Entrepreneurship, Tax Incentives, and Procurement. Next slide. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the guiding principles that went into the development of the policy framework that will be in the report. These are things that we were very mindful of and used as basically the construct for considering all of the options within the tenets that we discussed. So disability is a natural part of the human experience that does not diminish one's right to fully participate in all aspects of community life, and particularly in securing employment or self-employment. Disability can develop at any point during an individual's lifetime, and it certainly has varying impacts on both the individual as well as the family that supports them. Successful disability policy should embrace the nothing about us without us principle, so that everyone is incorporating a mindful approach to providing opportunities for people with disabilities. We certainly understand that they are underutilized in our workforce and certainly experience social and economic disadvantages as a result of that underutilization. And people with disabilities have valuable and unique contributions that they can make to employers and the workforce at large. Next slide. So we obviously have an approach to disability and looking at it at the state level as an official. And we have to understand that everyone benefits when individuals with disabilities are in the workforce. They gain independence and they contribute to the overall economy in the areas that they support. And the labor force gains workers with these valuable skills. States experience the economic success, and we always have to look on the next steps within crafting policy that can enhance and continually improve the conditions for persons with disabilities. Next slide. So our committee focused on how state government policies, programs, and funding opportunities can create an increase in initiatives, as well as the number and diversity of self-employed individuals with disabilities, as well as those businesses owned by persons with disabilities. And it focused on a number of things: entrepreneurship training strategies, teaching people with disabilities how to set out on their own, taking an idea and creating a business, and then having the support structure necessary to carry on and assist them in growing that enterprise. Financial supports should be there and established for business owners with those disabilities, so they understand the opportunities that are out there for them. And then obviously we need to have state procurement policies that are specifically targeted to disability-owned businesses. Next slide. So we have to lay the groundwork and build that capacity, sustainability for disability inclusion efforts, and that obviously involves a number of things. Many businesses have expressed in our research that while they are open to it, they just simply don't know the process for hiring persons with disabilities and what type of work environment should be provided for these folks. So technical assistance should be available where you have subject matter experts that can assist a company or a business in designing the workplace, designing policies, providing coworker training and mentoring so that they can embrace those persons coming in to work for them. Develop databases that obviously track how these persons are entering the workforce and how they're contributing to it, because any measure of success has to be a metric and a key performance indicator that can be tracked over time. We have to expand the diversity and inclusion policies within these businesses. So obviously convening a task force is beneficial, it's targeted and directional, and it helps to coordinate the support strategies moving forward. Obviously we looked at tax incentive policies and tax credits for employment support, and we've got some information coming on that. Next slide, please. So tax incentives, we explored the opportunities to supplement existing financial incentives for businesses that target the disability employment, and then certainly supporting those efforts. Some suggested strategies that came out of that was to adopt a state-earned income tax credit to increase the support for low-income workers with disabilities, and adapt a state-earned income tax credit that reduces the age, much like what Michael mentioned, from 25 to 18, and enhance the credit for single filers who are Social Security beneficiaries with disabilities. We also looked at allowing for tax deductions for a percentage of contributions to states achieving a better life experience accounts. Next slide. So an example of this would be in Maryland, where they have Achieving a Better Life Experience program. It was enacted in 2016 as House Bill 431, and it allows for a deduction on state tax liability for contributions to ABLE accounts, which Michael went into detail earlier about. The bill provides for an individual return annual limit of $2,500 in subtraction to adjusted gross income, with a provision allowing the remaining balance on contributions in excess of $2,500 to be carried over to the next 10 consecutive taxable years until the balance is exhausted. Next slide. So in addition to assisting businesses, we understand that there is a desire and need for persons with disabilities to create their own self-employment by being entrepreneurial. And some policy options that we looked at the state level would be to ensure that the state workforce development systems that we have support entrepreneurship and training and encouragement, increasing the awareness of this in terms of self-employment as a viable option for these folks. Also, states should include disability-owned businesses in targeting state procurement, the certifications that have been mentioned that Jill talked about, and financial incentive policies as well. Next slide. So looking at some examples of this, Alaska, Florida, and New York participated in the Department of Labor and ODEP's Startup Demonstration Project, which explored opportunities to coordinate state workforce agencies and community organizations that really provide that connective tissue at the local level. This targeted self-employment for people with disabilities and has already seen some seeds for success. Next slide. Another example of state policy in Connecticut, they have a Supplier Diversity program, which requires state agencies to set aside at least 25% of their budgets each fiscal year for small contractors. And of this set aside, 25% must be reserved for awards to minority business enterprises, including those that are disability owned. Next slide. So obviously we're going to be open for questions or comments. As with anything, this is a living, breathing document that we look to increase and enhance on a daily basis. And most importantly, taking and extracting what we learned as a task force and certainly as a subcommittee and making it actionable for persons with disabilities. So please check out the CSG eCademy that Deb has mentioned before. And you see some important dates there on upcoming events, and then the December 8th Disability Employment Policy Academy is coming up as well. And that's all I have. Deb, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Ted. One of the questions might be, since you're a state official in Texas or in Tennessee, a T state, could you tell us a little about how this issue worked out in your own state?
Well, sure, and thanks for that question. You know, we do have tax credits that are specifically targeted for the hiring of persons with disabilities. In this case, in Tennessee, it's a one-time tax credit that's available to qualified employers who establish either full-time or part-time jobs for persons with disabilities who are receiving state services directly related to such disability. And these credits are allowed against a qualified employer's franchise and excise liability tax that they pay in the state. And there are two varying amounts, $2,000 for each qualifying part-time job that a business creates, and then $5,000 for each qualifying full-time job that's created. And again, all Tennessee job tax credits allowed will apply for the year in which the jobs were established. So that's been widely used and accepted by businesses, and then we have a statewide entrepreneurial ecosystem that certainly promotes and markets the availability of resources to all of our citizens, but in particular we have programs that specifically target minorities, women, veteran, and persons with disability-owned businesses.
Well, thank you very much for that. From the work that the committee did and the task force has done, this may not be a fair question, says the respondent, but could you give us an idea, besides your own state, of a couple of states that you all looked at that you think are particularly good examples of creative use of tax incentives?
Yeah, sure. So we obviously have looked at a number of those states, and I think that the ones that we cited in the presentation today are certainly those that are leading the charge on that. Alaska, Florida, New York, Connecticut, certainly those that are offering proclamations on making this an important tipping point issue at the state level and crafting policies, and Pennsylvania is one of those that Jill mentioned that is showing leadership in that area. So in Tennessee, we actually, on a 5-year basis, every 5 years, we look at the competitiveness of our tax credits, and we were one of 6 states that participated in looking at the entire structure of tax incentives, and this is a particular area that we are focused on in terms of enhancing what we afford businesses and how they can utilize it in increasing that awareness that this is out there and that it can be used to apply to a benefit to the business, but then also as a human element, it's providing for opportunities for those persons to gain employment.
Okay, thank you very much. We don't have any more questions today, so those of you who are listening in, if you're shy, you have contact information from each of our speakers, and I think that they're all looking forward to having conversations with people about this issue. One of the things that surprised us at CSG was the very high level of interest and energy as we pulled together the National Task Force, as we engaged in the examination of issues and examples of promising practices in this field. So there are a lot of people who are very anxious to talk about these ideas and to spread them to other states besides their own. So I encourage you with that. Ted did mention there are a couple more webinars that are going to continue this discussion, I believe on the following 2 Tuesdays coming up. Lisa nods her head, yes. The following 2 Tuesdays we will have webinars that address the other issues the task force took up, and then as we said in December the report will be issued, and we encourage you to read our materials and join us on this journey to employ more people with disabilities and to encourage states to enact policies. So that's our webinar for today. Thank you, Ted and Jill and Michael, who's off to his other important meeting, and we encourage you to join us for the next 2 webinars. Thanks, everybody.